Okay, so in this video I'm pretty much only going to be talking about my own ideas and a little bit of Twistor Theory. Basically I had this idea based off of Twistor Theory, which is branched contours, that each of these spaces would be like a Ket space, and the Palatial Twistor Theory tells you how you can map them to create smooth space-times, and that's kind of the solution to the Word's puzzle and nth degree cohomologies. So you can imagine a sphere packing of Riemannian spheres that resolve nth degree cohomologies. Also just talking about Wolfram's idea of universal computational complexity and the equivalence principle of it. This would be the same thing as a multiversal equivalence principle for computational complexity. So it came from my previous video. I was talking about ergodicity and how you can create an ergodic graph out of sphere packing, and you can always kind of translate an ergodic graph into a sphere packing. And these are actually cohomologies when they're transformed in the sphere packing. The way they interact. There's this thing called topological knotting. So you can think of two donuts next to each other. They're tied together in the middle. If you watch a video, I think it's called Tentacles, akimbo, by it's a math YouTube channel. Then it'll show you how you can create those knots. The point is that a sphere is defined differently depending on how many dimensions it's in. In 0 dimensions it's a point, in 1 dimension it's a circle, in 2 dimensions it's a plane. But 1 dimension is a string, 2 dimensions is a circle, circular plane, 3 dimensions is a sphere, 4 dimensions. It actually is a series of toruses once it's projected back into real space. So if you take Twistor Theory to be a way of producing hyperbolic spacetimes in real projective space, that thing I was talking about in the previous video, then you only have to worry about the real projective solutions. You can do the math in the complex space, but you can think of it as Apollonian sphere packing. So on a sphere, that's where you'd be packing. You could do it on any not Euclidean, non-Euclidean space, doesn't matter. But if you're packing points, you'd want to use the Fibonacci spiral flower method. It's preferred on a flat space, a parabolic space, or a hyperbolic space. It would just conform to the curvature, but it would always be the Fibonacci spiral flower method. In 2 dimensions, it's the flower method where you have 6 around a central. And then you can do it fractally, so inside each circle you can do another one, and you can go outwardly, and so it's divergent, conversion, and fractality. Same thing with 3 dimensions. You can have 12 spheres. I just ... 12 to keep the pattern going. And in the crevices in between, you can include more sphere packing, so equal size. And within those crevices, you can keep going. So it's the same thing as the Apollonian sphere packing or gasket. That's exactly what that is. But in 4 dimensions, we can't really explain the geometry of it, but as it's projected into real space, it would appear as toruses. So the only thing that distinguishes the variations of topology in the universe, in a universe, is the way that topological knotting occurs. Because when you have topological knotting, as in those they're like hop links, not exactly, in that one video called Tentacles, Akimbo, which I can put in the description of the video, they become chiral depending on how they're knotted. The spinners are essentially the fundamental unit that make up the twistors, and they have this property of chirality. So they're the ones that are doing the topological knotting. But what's important is this complex space that's actually defining the sphere packing in real projective space, which everything you can be considered an n-dimensional sphere. There's no subspace that isn't an n-dimensional sphere. So pretty much all you have to do is think about it as dynamically converging and diverging. These can be shrinking or growing, however, and it has to keep the symmetries as much as possible. It's really just dynamic Riemannian sphere packing. That's pretty much what Twistor Theory is. And so that took me to a couple of ideas, because in the last video I was going to talk about how you can think of the brain as an ergodic graph. You can think of it as all of these topological knottings. But the cool thing about the brain is that it's recursive, so it has an extra layer of recursion. It's being geometrically selected for based off of sensory input. So there's this fractal surface, which is our sensory inputs, whether it's sound or being like the hairs in our ears and the way that chemotaxis works, and it's the chemical receptors, or if it's our eyes. So mostly it's our eyes now, because most of the cortex has adapted to process that information. And so our consciousness is kind of balanced. It's kind of following some sphere packing rules based off the complex projective space of the information that's hitting, the light information that's hitting our eyes. But you can think of the fact that we are creating an artificial intelligence as an imbalanced consciousness growth. It's being geometrically selected based off of biases from our own consciousness. I thought that was important to mention. But yeah, I had mentioned cohomological games, the idea that you can have local zero-sum games, and then the total could be inconsistent. Globally, it could be a cohomology between those zero-sum games and make it impossible. So it's a lot like this sphere packing. There should be enough dynamical rules for the projective space of this higher dimensional sphere packing complex, Riemannian sphere packing, that gives you nth dimensional cohomologies or nth degree cohomologies. And these are like zero-sum games that are incompatible, same thing. And it's a lot like when I was talking about the simplest way to think about it is if you were starting this packing of points on this sphere, and you started a pole, and the pole's going to be on the other side. The Fibonacci flowering method is going to start to the other, it's going to curl around. But then if you start here just almost at the same time, it's going to mess up this pattern. That's the simplest version, but there's nth dimensional cohomologies that actually follow nth dimensional sphere packings. And then that whole video with the Meru Foundation and the matrix of meaning is really about what geometrical selection is. So the interesting thing is that the neuromorphology of any species tends to be similar because we have a similar genetic basis. So the initial recursion factor is genetics, which has a common structure because we have common ancestors. Every species on the planet has a common ancestor of the original RNA structure. So, I mean, it's shown that in electrodynamics, everything is based off of spinor dynamics. So there should be some kind of spinor dynamic that has in its property of evolution what geometrical selection is this most efficient way of packing spheres when it's projected into real space. So whatever it's actually representing in complex space when it's projected into real space. So you can you can think of it like a game tree. Like I mean, in evolution they often talk about the tree of life and how you can think of it that way, but you can think of it not in terms of natural selection of survival of the fittest, but you can think of it in terms of geometrical selection and the fact that there was a point in which the geometrical selection of that species diverged. There was a cohomology in that species, the geometry of that species. Whether that's because they were separated and were under different conditions of sphere packing, whether that's because they took in different inputs, they were exposed to different environments. One was outcompeted by a variation in local sphere packing compared to a different part of the sphere packing in another species, in the same species, but in a different group of that species. You can reinterpret also not just biological evolution, but also because this is fundamentally Palatial Twistor Theory, which I'm just calling Riemannian Sphere Packing, is a theory of physics. It explains a fractal multiverse. It explains everything, but just to think of it in terms of the brain, in terms of evolution. And so that kind of left me with this last idea, which I probably had more that I might have missed, but I'll make another video later if I did, which was the limits of consciousness or to consciousness. It seems that fundamentally there is a limit to how quickly we can process information. So we know that the N400 means that we're doing it at a ventilated potential within around 400 milliseconds, and that auditory processing, if you mix it up within 50 milliseconds, as long as you keep it in order, you're still going to process the same meaning, because near your Wernicke's area, you have different areas that specialize on processing different frequencies of sound, and so you can decompose it and still reorganize it into something that's meaningful. So there's probably some equivalence to areas in the visual cortex that process different frequencies of light, and they are defining a lower limit because light is the fastest possible thing that could be transmitting information to us. It is everything, light is everything, but really it's twistors that make up light. But that similar idea should be the frame rate or frequency limit to consciousness. And you can think of the spatial limit being proportional to the frequency limit. So you can think of if we created an Internet of Things that all had neuromorphic architectures, and we somehow were able to link it to brains, and the entire planet was covered in conscious material, and the entire planet, the surface was conscious, that would be maybe like a local limit to the area or volume of consciousness. So we have frequency, we have area, volume. The information transfer would be like temperature. Basically what I'm trying to do is compare the limits of consciousness to black hole, which is already ideas. There's a fundamental computational limit to how much information you can process before matter itself will turn into a black hole. Basically, there's a limit on internal information transfer in integrated network. And I forgot exactly the scientist. I can look it up later, but also put in the description of the person that came up with that. But I was just thinking about how that's dependent on the material that's doing the processing, obviously. So we're nowhere near the limit. Even an AI made out of some kind of material that, I don't know, was just like super futuristic, like metallic hydrogen, wouldn't approach the limit. There's there is a limit though, and it would be approximated by the conformal space we're embedded in, which is the surface of the black hole, that where the complex space that we're the projective space of is. But yeah, Penrose had been working on Twistor Theory for like over 50 years. He's talked about VSLs, he's talked about fractal universes, he's talked about different problems with locality and quantum mechanics and how to resolve them with Twistor Theory. This Palatial Twistor Theory has created a way to combine commutative and non-commutative algebras. And I mean, aside from my idea of a cosmological gradient averaging to zero, the whole Kugelblitz black holes being between the Planck, being the entanglement entropy of the points you can think of as sphere packing points on an event horizon, between the event horizon and the firewall, and the idea that his theory is really about Riemannian sphere packing. Aside from that, he's already resolved it. So the last thing I wanted to say is, I was talking about Jacob Barnett. He's a prodigy. he has Asperger's. He's an autistic. I'm not sure if he's a savant, but he's very intelligent, and he taught himself up to college level math when he was just a young teenager. And he has the ability to imagine geometrical shapes as they were projected into real space. And he's demonstrated that already mathematically. So if someone could resolve